Hello, welcome to Chapter 21, America and the Great War. Okay, these are the highlights that we don't usually pay attention to, so we're going to skip this. Okay, this is your framework for the chapter. So the first half of the chapter will be imperialism. Essentially, you have the three presidents, Roosevelt and his big stick diplomacy, Taft and his dollar diplomacy, Wilson and his missionary or moral diplomacy. Then the later half of the chapter, you get into World War I, both the execution of World War I in Europe, as well as the domestic changes that happen here in the United States. Okay, so it starts off with Roosevelt and his definition of civilization. So Roosevelt's definition of civilization essentially had to be two things. You had to be white and you had to have economic development in your country. And those two things would qualify you for civilized. The one exception, however, was Japan, which was economically developing but was not white. So they were kind of like honorary civilized. Protecting the open door in Asia, we get down here to the Great White Fleet. That is Roosevelt trying to maintain the open door in Asia. Japan was threatening to close off trade to some of its markets. Roosevelt sends the Great White Fleet on a world tour to kind of flex and show the U.S.'s muscle, kind of as a cautionary tale to all countries. Okay, here's a map of U.S. involvement in Latin America, Central America. And this epitomizes the big stick diplomacy. So if you look here in Cuba, the U.S. had sent troops at 3 different times. If you look at Haiti, you can see that the U.S. ran finances from 1915 to 1934, as well as financially supervised from 1915 to 1941. So that is the very definition of using the big stick when necessary. Okay, we've talked about this before here, and the Roosevelt Corollary is an offshoot to the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine says European powers stay out. What happened here in the early 1900s is European powers such as Germany were threatening to come in and get their money that was owed to them by some of the Latin American countries, Dominican Republic being the first one. So Roosevelt kind of issued the statement that European countries cannot come in because that would violate the Monroe Doctrine. However, the U.S. could intervene and did intervene, and so they would go in and get their money for those European powers. So Dominican Republic, they went in, organized their custom houses, collected taxes, used some of it to pay off Germany, and used the other part and give to the Dominican Republic so they could run their country. Okay, the Platt Amendment we already know from previous chapter with our involvement with Cuba. So after the Spanish-American War, Cuba could not sign any treaties that would infringe on her territory. The U.S. had the right to intervene at any time necessary, and they could maintain a naval base there, Guantanamo Bay, which we give rent checks to apparently every year, but they do not cash. When it comes to the big stick, though, probably nothing epitomizes it more than the Panama Canal. So the French Canal Company had built, I believe it was 40% of a canal in Panama, the narrowest point in Central America. We were going to buy the rest of it. Colombia, which owned Panama, which controlled Panama at that time, wanted money for it, 40 million. I believe Teddy Roosevelt called that highway robbery. So he sponsors a revolt in Panama, encourages the Panamanians to revolt, parks the USS Nashville down there to make sure Colombia doesn't interfere. The revolt is successful. The U.S. immediately recognizes and then signs a treaty for 10 million to get the canal zone and payments out. Okay, with Taft and dollar diplomacy, this is a little bit different. So it's less use in the military, but using dollars. So that means using investment, using loans to get what we want in Central America. So a slightly different tack than what Roosevelt had done. When it comes to Wilson's moral diplomacy, so it is about trying to do the right thing, less about just furthering U.S. interests. You can see that in our affairs here in Mexico. That is something that gets talked about in every single textbook for some reason. I guess it just is the best example of Wilson's moral diplomacy, short of getting involved in World War I. But there you go. Okay, so meanwhile, while this is happening, Europe is breaking into war. So as you probably know from your world history classes, the four main causes: militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. Essentially, there's a bunch of secret alliances in Europe. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip of the Black Hand triggers war because Austria-Hungary will declare war on Serbia, which has treaties with Russia, which has treaties with France. I'm sorry, and Austria-Hungary has treaties with Germany. And so Europe breaks out into war. And Wilson tells the Americans that we are going to remain neutral. There are many Americans that are first or second generation heritage from Germany and from England, so we have people with ties to both sides. However, that doesn't mean that we can't trade with both sides, and so we do that. And so we have economic ties to Britain, and it actually increases more with Britain because what happens is Britain will blockade Germany, and after their blockade of Germany, the U.S. essentially cuts trade to Germany because we're not going to fight through the blockade, but does continue to trade with Britain, which will obviously lead to a growing imbalance of trade between the two sides in the war. One of the other problems that we have is with the Lusitania. So the U.S. maintained that we have the freedom to travel the seas. We're not at war, we're neutral. Germany is using the new technology, the submarine. And so unfortunately, like unlike previous wars where you could stop a ship and you could board it and you could take contraband and even impress sailors, submarines you can only shoot. And so the Lusitania is a British passenger liner that is sunk by a German submarine, and it kills Americans on board. We're outraged, and the Germans promise not to do that again. So 1916 election, Wilson and his supporters will end up campaigning on the slogan of "He kept us out of war," because the U.S. is still not involved in the Great War over in Europe. Wilson wins re-election pretty handedly. Okay, however, we are getting ever so slightly dragged into war. The Zimmermann telegram is a telegram from Germany to Mexico, and it is encouraging Mexico to join a war if needed, because if they join the war and if they're on the winning side, they could recover all the lost lands from the Mexican-American War, so essentially the America Southwest. So Mexico could get that back if the U.S. joins the war, and Mexico would like to join in on the side of Germany. From there, we will pivot to entering World War I. It no longer is about keeping us out of war, but it becomes a war to end all wars, a war to save democracy. So it has a much grander purpose than just winning a war. Okay, so we entered the war, and unfortunately, Russia leaves the war. So they have the Communist Revolution. They leave the war, so it's good timing on America's part. The American Expeditionary Force, essentially, it's the first time we draft our soldiers. So we don't have enough soldiers. We're moving away from the voluntary army that is citizen-led, that carried us all the way up to really the Spanish-American War. In the class I mentioned, Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. Now we're going to have a draft, and so we end up drafting 3 million soldiers to fight. And that includes African American soldiers who will serve in segregated forces. Oftentimes they had the menial jobs, but they did experience some degree of fair treatment while fighting in Europe. Okay. One of the other side notes, they did test the soldiers that we drafted, and they found out that a good portion of them were morons. So thank you, modern day IQ tests in the early 1900s. Okay, we don't really talk about battles, so we're going to skip this slide. Okay, the new technology of warfare. What World War I turns out to be is anything but the glamorous battle the glamorous experience of war that was experienced in the Spanish-American War. If you remember, the Spanish-American War was a splendid little war. World War I is anything but that. So what are some of the new battle techniques? Both sides essentially dig in with the trenches and deep trenches, which means there's a big no man's land between them, which also means that there's not a lot of movement. Occasionally people would lose their minds and run across no man's land only to be quickly mowed down. Being in the trenches, you get trench foot, you get rats, and you get a horrible way of dying when they shot the mustard gas and you didn't get your gas mask on, and the gas would just settle in the trenches. Additionally, there are also tanks for the first time. So open battle flamethrowers, the previously mentioned mustard gas, and airplanes, but the airplanes were more for dogfights and reconnaissance, occasionally the bombing, but they don't play a pivotal role in World War I. Okay, so, and as I mentioned in class, kind of one of the big takeaways here is the sacrifice and the promise of technology and progress really just gives us a faster way to kill each other and at higher numbers. Okay, there's the war map. Meanwhile, on the home front, how do we finance the war? We will pay for the war through bonds and income taxes. And so we raised $23 billion in Liberty bonds, if you look at the poster next to us. Also raised the income taxes to 70%. And kind of that idea is that nobody should profit off of war. Okay, so that's one of the rationales behind such a high income tax. The War Industry Board, they will coordinate production, they will coordinate the government purchase of goods. Okay, and so they will set prices, help coordinate the production as well. I take that back. And so that becomes their role, although we never really become a major supplier during the war. In fact, we have to use British and French equipment. It's not until World War II where we become the arsenal of democracy. Lessons of the Spanish economy is that, hey, if this works, maybe we carry it on into peacetime. One of the other things you should note is the NWLB, the National War Laborers Board. National War Labor Board, to encourage workers, because if you think about it, all the men went out to work. How do you encourage workers to come there? They gave them the 8-hour workday. They promised equal pay for women. They promised collective bargaining rights for the workers. They promised gave them a minimal standard of living. The one thing the workers could not do is go on strike, because that would hurt the war effort. Ludlow Massacre, however, despite the going on strike, Ludlow is a town in Colorado, mining town. The workers go on strike. They're all kicked out. All families are living out in tents, and then the troops are called in to protect the strike breakers. Violence breaks out, and there are men killed. One of the worst massacres that have occurred as a result of worker protest. Okay, the economic and social results of the war. We do have a transformation of society. We have blacks that move up from the south to the north to fill the pull factors. There are factory jobs that are open there and need to be filled, but they're also escaping the Jim Crow and the lynching of the South. Okay, so you have push factors that move them out of the South, pull factors that pull them up to the north. However, the north is not paradise, and once they get there, there are race riots, and so many people in the north aren't accustomed to, or they already have their own kind of patterns of segregation in the north. So as blacks are moving into the neighborhoods, as they're moving into the workplace, that causes friction with the whites that are living up there. So there's a series of race riots actually in 1919. Here's a picture of women at work. Okay, so some women opposed the war, such as Carrie Chapman Catt. Some women were for the war, such as NASA, if you remember, the group that helped win suffrage. Okay, so how do we help sell the war and suppress dissent? The Committee on Public Information is led by George Creel, a Hollywood producer. The CPI is going to encourage self-censorship for newspapers. Okay, they were also the people that make the posters. They make the posters that encourage Americans to do their part in the war effort. They will also train the 4-minute men that would often give speeches before movies and give a pitch to Americans on why they should buy bonds and how they can help. The Espionage and Sedition Acts are essentially ways of repressing dissent. And so how do you the Espionage Act bans spying and sabotage. Sedition Act, you can't criticize war, the war effort, the government, essentially anything related to the war. And so it is pretty serious. In particular, the repressing dissent, that is bad news for any socialists and IWW members, particularly Eugene Debs, if you remember him from the Pullman strike. He lands in jail for criticizing the war. Actually runs for president while he is in prison. Okay, the 100% Americanism is where you get the anti-immigrant, anti-German feeling. So this is where schools will stop teaching German. They'll stop playing Bach and Beethoven. They rename things like sauerkraut to Liberty cabbage, and the hamburger to the Liberty sandwich. The Frankfurter becomes the hot dog. That's all part of this war effort. Okay. Oh, one of the other things I forgot to mention in terms of the Committee on Public Information, one of the fun things is, so they needed people to they needed the food to feed the soldiers, so they would have slogans like meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays and foodless Fridays, to just getting on the Friday part, to in order to get people to sacrifice and ration their food. Okay, so Wilson's vision for the world, again, it wasn't just going to be a war as he envisioned it, but this was going to be the war to end all wars. And so he had given a speech for his 14 points. Okay, so this is how we're going to prevent future wars. We're going to ensure freedom of the seas. We're going to make sure that there's no secret treaties, that territories have the right to self-determination. That we are going to reduce armaments around the world, and most importantly, that we are going to create this League of Nations. So there'll be this world body that will help negotiate conflict before war breaks out. Okay. And part of that problem is that the Allies aren't going for that. So they're not in for idealism; they're in for a pound of flesh. Okay. So at the Paris Peace Conference, you have the big four. You have Wilson from the U.S., you have David Lloyd George from Great Britain, you have Vittorio Orlando from Italy, and George Clemenceau from France. And again, they are not in the forgiving mood. So they want Germany to pay reparations. They want Germany to actually assume war guilt and then pay reparations. And so Wilson's coming in there with all of his high idealisms, but they're not in that mood. And Wilson actually makes some other mistakes coming to the conference as well. So he does not bring a single Republican senator to the peace conference with them, even though he will need to get that treaty through the Senate. He doesn't bring a single senator. Again, he has this, and the second thing, he kind of has this messiah complex that the European leaders resent. So what happens is essentially all these 14 points get thrown out. We're down to the League of Nations. Wilson is holding on to the League of Nations, and Henry Cabot Lodge is a Republican, and the leader of the reservationists. And so the reservationists do not want to ratify this League of Nations. Kind of similar criticisms to what we have today with the UN, that giving up your sovereignty to some unelected world body would not be good for America, because that could lead us to trouble. But Wilson is stubborn. You're going to get this in your 8x11. Wilson is stubborn. He is refusing to yield. In fact, he goes on a cross-country tour to try to convince Americans that he is right. Okay, and Henry Cabot Lodge gives a little bit, but not enough. Unfortunately, Wilson has a stroke while he's on this cross-country tour and is bedridden for the last several months of his presidency. Essentially, they think his wife and his chief of staff are running the country, because nobody has seen Wilson, nobody sees Wilson, nobody really knows what happened to him after that. All in all, what happens is the League is rejected by America. Okay, and we have to sign a separate peace to end the war. Okay, so back here in America, well, actually, we were still in America. We have a new social environment. So we talked about blacks moving up north, but really what happens in the economy probably is of greater importance. Okay, and so we have a post-war recession. So World War One, what happens as soon as World War One, as soon as it's over, all the government, members of the War Industry Board, they are calling the businesses, the factories, and they're canceling orders left and right. We don't need this anymore. The war is over. And so that triggers a recession. And on top of that, they also lift the price controls. And so coupled with the decreased production, you also have increased prices because all this pent-up demand. People weren't buying things during the war. So you have recession. Prices are going up. Of course, that leads then the unions to strike. So Boston, one of the most famous ones, The Boston police strike. So the Boston police, like it sounds, they went on strike looking for higher pay. Of course, if the police go on strike, that's going to lead to chaos. And kind of who saves the day is Calvin Coolidge, who will be president later in the 1920s. But he is governor of Massachusetts. He ends the Boston police strike. Says no one has the right to strike that threatens public safety. I certainly butchered that quote. Anyways, that's the Boston police strike. But what the part of that backdrop is, there's a lot of strikes going on, and that is making people afraid. And I'll tell you that in a sec. Well, why in a second. Okay, so for African Americans, so they had gone to World War I fighting and segregated with segregated troops because they had hoped they could prove their loyalty and prove that they demanded or that they deserved better rights. Of course, none of that works. And so again, there are more African Americans than North, and so there's a series of race riots in 1919, Chicago, Detroit, New York. So in the North, a lot of them in the Midwest. Chicago race riots in particular, a black teen was swimming in Lake Michigan, drifted too close to the white part of the lake. They started throwing rocks at him, and he was hit in the head, unconscious, and drowns. The blacks go rampaging through the white part of town, and whites do the same thing to the black part of town. There's a lot of deaths. It's not unique that there's kind of race riots. What makes this unique is that blacks actually fight back this time. Okay. We have a new leader for African Americans, and so if you remember, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington are still kind of around. We have Marcus Garvey shows up on the scene, and he is advocating black nationalism. So he says blacks should be proud of who they are. Black is beautiful. He himself dresses up like royalty, or I'm sorry, actually, I think like an admiral's outfit with his fancy hat. If you see pictures of him, he starts a Back to Africa movement, and so he is trying to raise money for a liner, for a ship, essentially to take blacks back to Africa. But in the meantime, they should, while they're here, they should patronize black businesses and support one another, and not be afraid, but be proud of their heritage. Okay, there's a map of that shows the African American migration, again from south to north. Okay, so on top of that, what we have is we have the Red Scare. So there are a lot of radicals that have come to this country, socialists, anarchists that come in, and so those strikes that were happening, made a lot of people fearful that the communist revolution, was coming here, because people think of unions as kind of socialist, maybe communist. Um, that is happening, and at the same time, there's a series of unexplained bombings around the country, and so the bombs are being mailed to famous people, celebrities, leading business officials. I believe Carnegie got a bomb, or was supposed to get a bomb, but that was stopped. A. Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General, his house even got the front of it blown off by a bomb. And so he and actually J. Edgar Hoover, who will show up later in history, initiate these Palmer raids, where they go they round up suspected anarchists and socialist radicals. I think 6,000 through the whole time. Actually deport 450 of them to Russia, even though they weren't convicted of anything or necessarily even Russian. They were just deported to Russia. All that this is the first Red Scare in American history. This kind of breaks down when Palmer promises there's going to be this great uprising during May Day. May Day is a special day on the communist calendar. When it turns out to be nothing, the whole Red Scare kind of fizzles out. Sacco and Vanzetti are two anarchists that are suspected of killing a paymaster, they call it, essentially somebody that handles the money of a shoe business in Massachusetts. Everyone feels like they are being convicted or being tried because of their beliefs, less because they actually did it. The judge is really racist and biased. They are sentenced to death, and they are both executed. But this just contributes, one, to the fear that radicals are taking over, but two, that we've kind of gone too far, and now people are guilty of their beliefs, less so for their actual actions. Oh, so I jumped the gun here. Refuting the Red Scare again, the whole Red Scare kind of fizzles out. So at the end of the day, what that really means is we are tired of sacrifice. The whole idea of progressivism and that we can make the world a better place through technology, through organizing society, doesn't seem to be true, and we are kind of disillusioned. And so, why sacrifice if it's all going to lead to nothing? The 1920 election is that pivot point. Um, Warren Harding promises a return to normalcy, and if he's elected, and he wins, he's a Republican, and will usher in a series 3 Republican presidents in a row. In 1920s, ushers in a new era, the Roaring Twenties. So that is the end of progressivism, end of World War I, and end of kind of sticking our nose overseas. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time.